But unfortunately, consumers don't shop on segment by segment basis. They shop based on pricing.
Search AutoTrader.
This is the Omoda C9, the Chinese brand's flagship product. Now, for those of you that don't know what Omoda is, it's basically a part of the Chery Group. Chery Group sell passenger cars in South Africa between 1,500 and 2,000 units per month, and Omoda and JQ form part of that. There's also a brand under the global Chery Group called Jetour, but that's not brought in by Chery South Africa. So I hope you're sufficiently confused by that. Today, we're going to be comparing this flagship C9 version of the Omoda to what I think is one of the best SUVs on the market, the Volkswagen Tiguan. You may be thinking, Sean, why are you comparing the C9 with the Tiguan? They don't compete with each other in a traditional segment by segment basis. But unfortunately, consumers don't shop on segment by segment basis. They shop based on pricing. And if we look at the price of this flagship C9, it's around 860,000 Rand at the time of launch versus slightly cheaper Tiguan at around 768,000 Rand, but the VW has some options fitted which take it to just under 900,000 Rand. Now, the Omoda also looks a bit bigger, and that's because it is, but when we look at the size of the boot and the general interior of the car, and we look at things like mass and all of those details that we'll go through just now, these cars are a lot more comparable than you might think. You may think that the two cars are mismatched in terms of their engines too. You see, the Omoda's got a 2-litre turbocharged petrol engine that produces 192 kilowatts and 400 newton meters of torque. It's paired with an 8-speed torque converter automatic gearbox, which is a first for the Chinese brands that I've driven at least. This Tiguan, on the other hand, has got the brand's 1.4-litre turbocharged petrol engine that produces 110 kilowatts and 250 newton meters of torque. And that's sent through a 7-speed dual-clutch automatic gearbox. This is a front-wheel drive car, and this is an all-wheel drive model. But you can get a front-wheel drive version of this Omoda with slightly less spec for under 800,000 Rand. But this is the car that's been provided to us. Similarly, you can also get a turbo diesel version of this Tiguan, but that starts at around 830,000 Rand, meaning with the options fitted to this car, that would be closer to $1 million. So it's possibly better that we have the 1.4 here. Now, you may think they mismatched, that the Omoda is going to be a lot better to drive or a lot faster, but that's not really the case. The Omoda is 2.3 tons. I couldn't believe it. I had to double check. Yeah, 2,300 kilograms. This is around 1,350 kilograms, so it's nearly a ton difference in terms of weight, and you can feel that out on the road. We'll take them both out on the road and I'll give you a more detailed driving impression shortly, but you can certainly feel that. And when we look at fuel consumption, well, the Omoda I've achieved on a combined cycle around 9.4 liters per 100 kilometers, a bit better than I had anticipated from such a big car. The Tiguan, my colleague Chad has been driving, but he hasn't done any open road driving. So his figure of 9.8 liters per 100 kilometers, I think might be a bit misleading. I genuinely believe the Tiguan will be the lighter car in terms of fuel consumption. Performance-wise, the Omoda feels okay. It's just really heavy. And the benefit of all-wheel drive means its acceleration feels okay. It's not super brisk, but it's enough. Tiguan, on the other hand, feels a lot lighter, a lot more nimble, but I'll unpack the performance more when we head out onto the road. The interior of the C9 is really impressive. As you might expect from a flagship Chinese product, it has got pretty much every conceivable feature in here. There's a level 2.5 semi-autonomous driver aid suite. So that includes things like blind spot assist, lane departure assist, lane keep, adaptive cruise control, head-up display, and a variety of safety items that you might want. Some of these can be quite intrusive, which I'll cover in the on-road driving review, but that combined with the 9 airbags mean that when this car is eventually crash tested, we anticipate it to achieve a 5-star rating, very much like the Tiguan. Looking at other features inside here, there's a lot of what I would call Mercedes influence. These dials here remind me a lot of that seen in the AMG GT series, and the adjustments for the seats are also straight from the Mercedes catalog, as are these window switches, very Mercedes-esque. We've also got some wood trim and this oddly shaped steering wheel, which I'm not the biggest fan of, but you know, that comes down to a question of taste, and when you have a hairstyle like this, you can't really judge aesthetics, can you? Starting this open here, we've got a little storage area. Also got cup holders and this felt-like material that extends to the top here, where you've got an area for your smartphone and a wireless charging pad. There's also this handy storage bin over here, which is also cooled by the rear climate control. Speaking of which, you control the climate by switches here. So it is an analog system, but you can also change various settings on the screen. So here we've got seats. As you can see, we've got driver and passenger heated and ventilated seats. And then at the rear, you can also have heated seats. There's also fragrances for the interior. So you can choose between go back here, you can choose between the natural, the cure, and the sport. I've been using the natural at 5. You can also set all of the different climate control settings over there, and it will show you your air quality and your various climate control settings here. To the right hand side, you've got a digitized instrument cluster. Now this shows you most of the semi-autonomous driver aids in the sense of what's happening. It's got object detection, cyclist and pedestrian detection, which is great. So it'll show you when there's a car in front of you or to your left-hand side, which is good at nighttime. Now, if you adjust it, you can also go into the map setting, and if you hold this in, you can change the digital cluster to a full map mode. Then to your bottom left, you've got your driving data. To your right, you've got more information, including your media, and then you've got the large map, which comes in handy when you're adjusting your climate or not using your CarPlay, for example. You can still have the map in front of you. Now, the system itself works okay. Resolution is decent. Possibly not a segment leading system, but it works well enough. When we have a look at features, there's wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, which I think once that's activated, you can forgive any other issues with the system. Looking at the cameras that you get, a 360-degree camera inside the C9, which includes a sort of bird's eye view for when you are approaching a junction, and various settings for when you are parking. So you can have a frontal rear view, you can have the side views of the car, and that's a very handy system. I just found the camera's resolution to not be as good as in the Tiguan. Looking at fit and finish, that's really where I find the C9 to be the most impressive. There's not really a material inside here that I find of a poor quality. Look at these seats. It's a beautiful textured leather. You can even adjust the front seats from the rear if you'd like more space. Dashboard material is soft. You get this wood-like material here, which I'm not the biggest fan of, but I understand it's part of the luxury appeal of the car. That extends to right over here. And there isn't really an area in the cabin that I find to be substandard. I did, however, notice, for the OCD among you, the door here, this crease doesn't meet perfectly with this area here, and that's exacerbated at night when the ambient lighting is shown and the two ambient lighting strips don't meet perfectly. So that's where you can see there's not that proper final polish. However, it is all very impressive, and it does a full ambient light show. You can set it to like a party mode and it will flash and look like a nightclub in here. I mean, I don't know how many times you're going to use that, but I suppose it's a cool party trick. Stepping inside the Tiguan, this update is extensive. I don't really recognize any of the interior here, which is a good thing. It feels like an entirely new car. In terms of quality and materials used, there isn't too much of a difference here. You might think that the VW is of a higher quality than the Omoda, but that's not really the case. They both feel like really high quality products. Where you do see a difference though is in the functionality of the infotainment system. This system in the Volkswagen is just superior to that one in the Omoda. VW have been doing this for a long time and it shows. The system is fast, super slick, and very intuitive to use. The Omoda can feel a bit clunky in comparison. VW has also added this very cool button here, which, as you can see, next to the start-stop button, you've got a volume control. But if you click down, that will also take you to your various driving modes, which you can adjust here. And we've got our electronic parking brake here too. In terms of storage, not quite as spacious as the Omoda in the center here. We've got our cup holders and you can hold quite a few, but there isn't that chilled glove box option like in the Omoda. There's also various areas to place your smartphone, which I think is a good idea in South Africa, you can hide it underneath here, and there's also a handy tray here for your goodies. There's also a digitized instrument cluster, and it is a better system than in the Omoda, a lot more legible and more customizable than the one in the Omoda. Looking at the seats, I don't know, I think the Omoda's seats are a bit better. They're a bit more plush, a bit more comfortable. But out on the road, we'll really see which one is better. Let's hop into the back of each car and check out both the rear occupant space and the boot space. Rear space, as I had anticipated in the Omoda, is exceptional. The Chinese products seem to get this so right. They place an emphasis on it. Have a look at how much room I have here. This is set up for a medium height driver, so around 1.8 meters tall. And look how much space I have, both head and legroom. Also got the ability to adjust your climate control and your heated seats, while there's also USB ports there and area for your drinks. It's really comfy. The Tiguan is also impressively spacious at the rear. Slightly smaller than the Omoda, but honestly quite easy to live with. Got loads of leg space, a little bit less headroom, but more than enough. Similar features to the Omoda, it's just your drinks parcel folds out like that. You've got ISOFIX anchor points just like the Omoda, and the seats are slightly less comfortable, same as the front, but honestly, as a family car, this is more than enough space at the rear. Looking at boot space, the Tiguan is slightly bigger than its predecessor with 652 liters of space. Let's compare with the Omoda by putting these two bags in the seat. See, there's plenty of space in there. Let's compare it to the Omoda, which currently only has 8 liters more space at around 660 liters. Really similar. Just because this parcel shelf folds forward there, it looks a bit more spacious, but honestly, there's not much to choose here between the two boots. So here we are on board the C9, and I have to say right off the bat, I've been driving this car now for an entire week, and I've been super impressed with the quality and the refinements on offer here. I drove the brand's C5 models, both the GT and the standard C5, and I was underwhelmed. It felt like they were not finished, like they had been developed to a certain point and then just sort of left and released to market. And I didn't find that too impressive from Omoda. It wasn't a good start for them. But now this C9 is a completely different thing. It is well thought out, well developed, and the execution is really good. The addition of a torque converter automatic has changed the drive quality of this car massively. You see, dual clutch gearboxes, by their very nature, unless you are a high-end brand like Porsche, they tend to be a little bit clunky and difficult at low speeds, and most Chinese manufacturers use these DCT gearboxes, either a wet or a dry clutch setup, regardless of which one they use, and the calibration seems to be a bit off. You combine that with throttle calibration, which is a little bit too eager, and you've got cars that tend to want a wheel spin and feel a little bit clunky and difficult to use at low speeds. With the addition of a torque converter though, with this car, it's smooth. Low speed operation is fantastic, and in most Chinese cars I would be tempted to use eco mode because the throttle response is dulled, which makes the experience a bit easier. But in this car, eco mode for me does what it's supposed to do. It helps save fuel, but ultimately it dulls everything down to a point where you think, I'm only going to really use this when I really need to save fuel. So I use the drive mode selector here. Now I'm in sport mode, as the Omoda reminds me. As you click, it tells you which mode you're in. So now I'm in normal mode, and this is where the car feels its best. And if you hear a beep, by the way, it's because I'm looking at you, the viewer, and the GoPro, and this little attention semi-autonomous driver aid monitor is noticing that I'm not paying attention to the road, so it's telling me that I'm distracted when it beeps. It's also telling me right now that there's a car in my blind spot on my left hand side on the screen, and it will also tell me if there's pedestrians and cyclists. But back to the drivetrain, I've been quite impressed. The addition of the torque converter has certainly changed the car. Another nicety is the tires fitted to this car, which you may not think is a big deal, but tires make a huge difference to a car. And many Chinese cars come with these weird brands, obscure brands we've never heard of that are untested within the local marketplace. I remember driving a Cherry that had Batman tires on, and I mean, that was cool, but I know nothing about Batman as a tire manufacturer. So seeing this with a set of Michelin Eco premises on, it made me realize that Omoda means business with this car, and the quality premium tires have helped with the ride quality, and they've also helped with sound insulation and the way that this car feels on the road. It's super quiet, it's super comfortable. The primary ride does have a tendency to be a bit crashy at times. It can be a bit firm over bumps, but the secondary ride, the characteristics that you feel out on the open road, and a lot of the ride characteristics that matter on a daily basis are really good. Same as the sound insulation and the general cabin intrusion. There's very little wind noise. You've seen those door handles that pop in and out depending on whether the doors are locked or open. Means the car is quite slippery. It's been designed to be quite aerodynamic, and you don't really get too much cabin intrusion as a result. The car feels very good and nice and refined. On a side note, the first time you drive this car, don't be alarmed when the car locks itself. Those door handles go back into the body, and this makes quite a loud, audible click, and you think maybe you've bumped something or run over something. It's just you locking the doors. And as you can hear, there's lots of beeps and audible bongs going through the cabin. And I've said in many Chinese products before, it's like the sensor or the sound that cried wolf. You hear so many of these sounds, these beeps and these reminders, that eventually you become numb to them. And when one sounds that you actually have to pay attention to, that may be a safety concern for you, you ignore it because you're so used to hearing beeps and bongs in the car. So for me, it's nice to have these semi-autonomous driving aids, but they just need to be polished and finished and integrated a bit better than they currently are in these cars. And I'm sure that will come with time. It's just incredible to think that we are driving an Omoda right now, a brand that has been in the market for around a year and has recently, along with JQ, overtaken a brand like Stellantis in the local sales charts. Taking a brand like that and comparing it with a juggernaut like Volkswagen, which, well, that Tiguan that we're going to hop into after this car is pretty much as good as SUVs get. So the fact that this car is comparing favorably in many areas to that Tiguan shows you how good the product is. The Omoda really feels at its best at medium to high speed. So I would say between 60 and 120 kilometers an hour, the car feels its best. And that's purely because it's heavy. At 2.3 tons, even though it's got plenty of power, 192 kilowatts and 400 newton meters of torque, you can feel the car is slightly labored at low speeds. And that's just purely down to that enormous weight that it's shifting around. But on the flip side, the weight comes into its own when you drive the car on the freeway, where it feels really solid, quiet, and refined. So that really brings me down to fuel consumption versus performance. So we've got all this power and torque, but we've also got tremendous weight. So how has this affected performance and fuel consumption? Well, in many ways, I've been quite surprised with how light this car is on fuel. You have to remember this car was dropped off at the AutoTrader office with 200 kilometers on the clock. It still had all the plastics on the various screens and interior bits that we've now peeled off ever so satisfyingly. And I have, throughout my 540 kilometers or so in the vehicle, registered a fuel consumption figure of around 9.4 liters per 100 kilometers. Now, for me, that's a very impressive figure for such a big car. That being said, the brand claims somewhere in the 7 liters per 100 kilometers, but we know that a lot of Chinese car brand claims of fuel consumption. In fact, it's not even a Chinese car brand, it's just car brands in general. They're quite generous with their fuel consumption claims. They don't provide a 0 to 100 time for the car, but it doesn't feel like a particularly brisk car. It feels like the power and torque is sufficient, but there isn't a lot of performance on offer here. Overall, really good package, nice and refined, quiet and comfortable, and for me, in many ways, it feels like Omoda has benchmarked a brand like Lexus when trying to create this car. There's a lot of things in here that remind me of Lexus, from the design to the way they've engineered the driving experience. There's a lot of Lexus in here. In spite of the aesthetics really looking like a Mercedes-Benz, I feel like it's a bit more Lexus-esque in its execution, which I think is a compliment. Righty. So I suppose that means we should now hop out of the Omoda and into the Tiguan and see how that often segment leading SUV compares to the C9. So here we are on board the Volkswagen Tiguan, and one thing that's immediately apparent is how much lighter this car is than that Omoda. Now, they claim it's nearly 1,000 kilograms difference between the two cars, and well, that would explain why this car in many ways feels a little bit more sprightly and peppy than that Omoda, despite having such a massive power deficit. There's around 82 kilowatts and 150 Newton meters difference between the two cars. So basically an entire budget car's difference, but there's also an entire budget car's difference in terms of weight. And of course, the Omoda has got all-wheel drive, which may help it in conditions that require that, but in daily driving, front-wheel drive mode makes the car feel nice and light and nimble. The Tiguan is of course a slightly smaller car too, but you wouldn't really notice that when you're inside. It just feels right. This is for me the best product that VW make, and it is really, really good. This facelift is a massive difference over the predecessor. It's a facelift, I guess, but in many ways they call it the new Tiguan, and I kind of understand why. It's the same platform, but it feels like a bit more than a facelift. It feels like an all-new model, in spite of it sharing so many of the underpinnings with this predecessor. We get to some of the areas where the two cars are similar and areas where they are different. They both have steering mounted or column mounted gear shift selectors, which save space in the center console. Now, they've chosen two very different ways of utilizing that space that they've saved, and that's in the Omoda. They've chosen to give you a lot more storage space. It rides a bit higher up here, versus the Tiguan, which is a little bit more focused on cup holders and smartphone storage areas, which are a lot lower down. And I suppose that's because the VW is a slightly shorter and narrower car. They don't have as much space to play with here in the center console. But an area where VW has truly got the Omoda beaten is in the interface and how you interact with the media and the vehicle functions. VW has done a proper U-turn based on feedback from journalists and customers alike, taking away that silly haptic feedback system on their steering wheels and replacing it with physical buttons. Now, the Omoda still has that haptic setup, which at night when it's clean looks great, but whenever there's direct sunlight on it, you cannot see which button you're pressing, and when it gets grimy, it looks really awful. These physical buttons in the VW, beg your pardon, are a lot better than what you see in the Omoda. When we compare the two infotainment systems, well, the Volkswagen system is just a lot more slick. It's a lot more intuitive, it's faster, the resolution is better, and the cameras that are linked to the system are also a lot better. The same can be said for this active info display. It is a bit easier to use, more configurable, and more legible at a glance, and that's really what you need from a car like this. Looking at drive characteristics, low speed, the Tiguan still suffers from when you have a dual clutch gearbox and a small capacity turbocharged petrol engine. Unfortunately, it can feel a little bit cumbersome and clunky at times versus the torque converter in that Omoda. But once you're past sort of first and second gear, it settles down nicely, and the primary ride on the Tiguan is really good. It absorbs bumps really well, but secondary ride characteristics and general refinement and cabin intrusion and penetration is not as good as in that Omoda. That Omoda feels like an isolation tank in many ways, whereas you get a lot more feedback from the road with the Tiguan. And I think in some ways I prefer that. If you're going for a more luxurious feel, the Omoda is certainly the way to go, but I prefer a car with a bit more feedback. I like to know what's going on, and I also like the car to feel a bit lighter and a bit more nimble. And for me, the Tiguan ticks that box. It feels the slightly more intuitive car to drive, the easier car to drive, and I think that ultimately comes down to it being more compact and a bit lighter than the Omoda. All things considered, it's quite incredible to be comparing a relatively new Chinese brand with an established player like Volkswagen with the Tiguan. I'm by no means suggesting that the C9 is a better product than the Tiguan. I think in many ways there's just a general polish and that final touch of engineering prowess that the VW has over that Omoda, but it's really close. And the Omoda comes with so much kit as standard. It really makes you wonder what VW is doing, offering all of these features as an optional extra within the car. This has got a suite of semi-autonomous driving aids and various other features, but I haven't really spoken about them because they're all optional extras, and if you go buy this car from the dealership, you'd have to tick those options. Same as this panoramic sunroof, which is standard in the Omoda, you have to pay for in this car, and all of those options mean that this particular Tiguan is more expensive than that Omoda by roughly 60,000 Rand with the options included. So it makes you wonder, should VW just start throwing all the bells and whistles on their products and just hiking up the price to adjust accordingly? Or do you think that they've got the pricing right, but the Chinese cars are just coming in at a ridiculously low price? For me, I think the Chinese are coming in aggressive to try and gain some market share, and VW for the most part has genuinely fixed its pricing issue. So this Tiguan for me is not a badly priced car, but maybe those optional extras need to be toned down a bit and a bit more standard kit needs to be included. And I suppose that's all we have for you today. I hope you found this review helpful between these two new models. You can't really go wrong buying either of them, to be honest. They're both great cars. They just appeal to slightly different people. For me, the Tiguan would suit my lifestyle a little bit better, whereas if you're going for a more luxurious look and feel, the Omoda is probably the way to go. Let us know what you'd like us to compare in the comment section down below next. Thank you guys so much for watching, and remember, if you're looking to buy or sell your car, search AutoTrader. Until next time, cheers.
Search AutoTrader.